Based on her research, Kathy Cramer will share with us what she has learned about what people in other parts of the state think about Madison and Madisonians and UW-Madison. We could probably just stop right there, couldn't we? For 5 years, actually, it's going to be interesting. She invited herself into coffee klatches in 27 communities across the state to listen to what people were saying. She is the director of the Morgridge Center for Public Service and a professor in the Department of Political Science at UW-Madison. She earned a BA degree there in the Department of Political Science and the School of Journalism and Mass Communication in 1994, and her PhD degree in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan in 2000. Her work focuses on the way people in the United States make sense of politics and their place in it. She's known for her innovative approach to the study of public opinion, in which she invites herself into the conversations of groups of people to listen to the way they understand public affairs. She's the author of several books and is also the recipient of a 2006 UW-Madison Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award, a 2012-14 UW-Madison Vilas Associates Award, a 2015-18 UW-Madison Leon Epstein Faculty Fellow Award, and is the recipient of the 2012 American Political Science Review's Qualitative and Multi-Methods Research Section Award for the best qualitative or multi-method submission to the review. And the University Bookstore will sell copies of her latest books immediately following the program at $30 a book. I should mention that the University Press, Pat McGowan, and the University Bookstore donate the proceeds of the sales of these books to the Madison Rotary Foundation, which leads me to also add that she will sign these books for you, and it's a bargain because if you count the number of letters in her name and the price, that's $2.73 per letter in the signature. It's a bargain. Looking forward to seeing you up here. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. It is really an honor to be able to share my thoughts with you and to be here, and thank you to friends who joined me and friends old and new whom I have a chance to connect with here at the Rotary. Thank you, President Ellsworth, and thank you for the donations on my behalf and the proceeds from my book that will go to the fund. That's really very touching. Thank you. So I'm going to tell you basically a story today. I'm going to start off telling you a little bit about myself and why I did this research, and then I will tell you what I heard that surprised me profoundly and why it matters for our politics. And I will tell you right off the bat, what I have to say is not uplifting, but I promise to finish by telling you a joke, which many of you have heard before, but it's my favorite. So here's the what you need to know about me. So here's the state of Wisconsin. Many of you are familiar with, all of you are familiar with. I grew up right here in Grafton, Wisconsin, between Milwaukee and Sheboygan. I am a lifelong Wisconsinite. The real truth in the matter is I was not born here, so I never say I'm a native Wisconsinite. I moved to Grafton when I was 4. And my entire time as a professor sprinting for tenure, I had dreamed that once I get tenure, if I earn tenure, I am going to dream up a research project that allows me to get out and about around the state. I love this place. I think it's beautiful, and I wanted to travel around and do my research in a way that allowed me to enjoy more of Wisconsin. I study public opinion, as President Ellsworth said, and I have always been interested in how people make sense of politics, sort of what's going through their minds when they think about politics, how they interpret politics. And I have found over time that it's easiest for me to do that by listening to people talking with other people in their own lives, as opposed to just talking to some university researcher or using survey data. So what I did was to carve up the state into several different regions, 8 different regions that were sort of similar. The counties were similar in political leanings, population density, type of industry, type of agriculture, and then I sampled some communities in each place. And basically, these are the 27 communities that I sampled, not labeling them to try to protect the confidentiality of the people that I studied. But what I was looking for were places where people get together on a regular basis, maybe a Rotary Club, where I could insert myself into, invite myself into, and listen to people talk about politics. So once I'd sampled these communities, I called up our great county cooperative extension offices in our 72 counties, and I said to the person who answers the phone, I said, I'm looking for a place where people get together on a regular basis in such and such Wisconsin. Do you know of such a place? Well, of course they did. Our extension educators know a lot about the communities that they serve, and so they pointed me to places like this. Cafes on a main street, gas stations, McDonald's, some places of worship, other places where you probably know of them in the communities that you're from, where people get together on a regular basis to share the news. Once I had identified such a place, so say for example, there's a small community in the middle of Wisconsin, and I've heard that at 5:30 every morning, people get together at the local gas and sip to talk. So I would drive up there, probably stay in a Super 8 the night before, drive up, park my car, take a deep breath, walk in and say, hi, I'm Kathy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Do you mind if I join you this morning? Yeah, and that did exactly that, right? They would laugh, they would chuckle, and they'd say, she's clearly nuts, but okay, you know. They would invite me in, and I would give them my business card, and I'd put my recorder in the middle of the table, and I'd say, would you mind if I turn on my recorder? It's just for me. No one's going to hear it. It's just for me to transcribe your conversation, and here's a football schedule or a pen or a pad of Post-it notes as a token of my appreciation. And then I would say, you know, I study public opinion. I'm really interested in what you think. Tell me, what are the big concerns here in this community? And I did that, so there were 39 different groups across these 27 different communities. I started in May of 2007. In the 2007-2008 academic year, I went around to most of these groups 2 or 3 times. And by the end of that year, I knew that I had heard something that was very troubling to me and was a surprise to me. You saw where I grew up. It's basically probably best called a suburban community. But my whole life, I had called myself a small town Wisconsinite. I know now that is not the case. Small town Wisconsin is, someone put it to me great once. They said, small town Wisconsin is not Grafton. It was 7,000 people probably when I was about 10. Small town Wisconsin fits on 1 floor of Ogg Hall, right? So here's what I learned. Here's the troubling thing. In our state, there is a significant rural versus urban divide, and there are many layers to it. What I heard from many people in small town Wisconsin was that there is a sort of mental map of this place in which there is Madison and Milwaukee, and then there is the rest of us. Sometimes people talk about it as the M&Ms, Madison and Milwaukee. Sometimes people call the rest of us outstate Wisconsin. You hear those terms once in a while. Honestly, M&Ms was new to me. You know, I was in my mid-30s when I started this project, but that was new to me. But there's this sense, there's this sense also that when people talk about Madison, they are talking about both the state legislature and UW-Madison, which was a surprise to me. We don't, at least in the current era, we don't necessarily think of those 2 institutions as the same thing. But a lot of times people were talking about Madison as that place where people are making decisions that affect my life. So here's the state of Wisconsin again. Sorry, I'm going ahead too far here. And I show this again just to point out that Madison and Milwaukee are the 2 main metropolitan centers of our state. And they are located in basically one part of the state, and there's a lot of other geography to Wisconsin, right? I find it helpful to look back at this map to remind myself that Wisconsin is a big place, and there's a lot of territory to it. Well, besides this mental map, this geographic map, here are the other ways I heard about a rural versus urban divide. One is that people perceived that all of the public dollars go to Madison and Milwaukee. The storyline I heard time and time again was that Madison sucks in all of our taxpayer dollars and spends it on itself or on Milwaukee, and we don't see that money in return. So it's partly about where the resources go. It's partly about power, too, in the sense that people perceive that all of the decisions are made in Madison and Milwaukee and communicated out to the rest of the state. and that there isn't listening going on in reverse. So the decisions are made down here, communicated outward, and that people in the rest of the state are relatively powerless. There's one other part to it too, and it's basically about respect. And that is that many times I heard people say to me, you know, people in Madison just don't get it. They don't understand our way of life, how we live, or what we value, and they basically fundamentally don't respect us. So these many different aspects of what I'm calling resentment are about sort of, you know, who has the power, who has the stuff or the money or the resources, and who gets respect. Well, I call this the politics of resentment. Like I said, not a very uplifting title or very uplifting topic, but it matters, unfortunately, for our politics and our public policy, and here's how. This resentment that I'm talking about, this rural resentment or resentment toward the cities, is just one kind of what I'm seeing as a politics of resentment across a lot of our politics. I'll come back to our presidential campaign in just a moment. But with respect to Wisconsin, here's how this resentment mattered for public policy. And what I mostly heard was how this resentment mattered for people supporting smaller government, or wanting less government, or wanting to support candidates who wanted to roll back government. Here's how it came across to me. One was that people would say to me, you know, look, Kathy, it's not that we're opposed to taxes in general. We're not opposed to government programs. But the thing is, if they ask us to pay more money, it's not going to help us. That money is going to go to Milwaukee. That money is going to go to Madison. So with respect to education in particular, I heard this time and time again. We care about education. We're willing to pay for it. But honestly, the funding formula in this state is not fair to communities like ours. Here's another way it came across to me. Even though, on average, 10% of the workforce in any community in Wisconsin is employed by a government, there's a sense that government is basically an urban thing. The people who are government employees are driven by urban decisions and urban values. And so government is not really one of us. It's not really a part of who we are. It doesn't understand people like us. And if you look around at our community, there's signs of it visibly dying or visibly decaying. Our kids aren't coming back if they go away to college. Our local businesses are closing. Our family farms are changing. Clearly, whatever government is doing, people would say to me, it is not working for us. So this obviously helps explain a bit why Act 10 could be so successful, right? Or why there was such public support for it. But there's more to it too. And this, I think, this last slide I'm going to show you about of these storylines is the most disturbing to me, because it's about judgments about other people in the population. So thinking of government as an urban thing helps explain why people in smaller towns would not necessarily want more government and might be supportive of cutting back on public employee pensions and health care, or making public employees pay in more to their pensions and health care. But partly it's also about judgments about who is deserving and who works hard in our population. Oftentimes what I heard was people saying, look, I'm working really hard. I am struggling to make ends meet. My taxes are going up, and they're going to pay for health care when I can't even afford it myself. That's wrong. Something has to change. There has to be an equalizing of benefits, and probably benefits is the best way to put it. Like I said, this is partly about judgments about who is deserving, right? And those judgments of who is deserving are intertwined with judgments about who works hard. I had many conversations about the nature of my work, and people would ask questions, especially in that first year of my fieldwork, 2007 to 2008. So how is it, Kathy, that you can be driving around the state, having coffee and pie with us, when you're supposedly a professor down there, right? I'd say, well, I'm on sabbatical. Okay, that's a little difficult to explain, right? But also, one of the best shorthands for this sentiment I came across was someone asking me, when do you take a shower every day? And I say, before I go to work. Where's this going, you know? And they'd say, I take a shower when I get home. I work so hard during the day that I have to take a shower when I come home. And to me, there was this distinction between those of us who sit behind desks for our living and other folks who work with their hands and with their bodies to make a living. And it was very much a cultural difference and a little bit, I have to say, in the moment, a little bit hard to explain what it is that I do and why. And trying to argue that I work hard too really lasted for about 2 seconds, right? You can imagine. It wasn't easy. All of this is to say these 3 different storylines of how this works is that this attitude of resentment toward the cities is kind of fertile ground for candidates who want to make an argument that government should be smaller, or that we should have fewer public employees, or that public employees should not have the benefits that they do. So a question that this helps me understand is when we think about why there is such strong support in outstate Wisconsin for less government, the way in which people in our rural areas in the state are understanding the role that government ought to play is through this lens of resentment. And this resentment is complicated because it's resentment towards many things at once. It's resentment towards cities and city people. It's resentments toward government and public employees. And I haven't said it yet on purpose, but it's clearly resentment towards people of color. I refrained from saying that until now because it's so easy to look at attitudes about people complaining about the cities to say they're a bunch of redneck racists and they're ignorant or they're stupid. And I hope if you take away one thing from my remarks today, that is not what you leave here thinking. Because there is racism in those sentiments, as there is racism in the sentiments here in Madison. And it's all too easy to write off these statements as like the result of people who are ignorant. But it's much more complicated than that. Everything I've told you is about the ways in which it's intertwined with a very complicated economic situation. But I also don't want to discount this element of it. The racial element to these attitudes is very scary, and this is partly why I feel it necessary to talk about the presidential race as well. So this is the context that we're in this context of resentment. None of this is easy, as I said. I want to show you some data on the allocation of resources briefly, because I know for some of you, you're wondering, yes, but it's not the case that rural areas don't get their fair share. I want to address that briefly. This chart is showing you a dot that represents, there's one dot for each of the 72 counties in the state. And I've arrayed the counties by how rural they are. I can explain how I did that later on. And then this is the state allocation in 2010 of state dollars to the 72 counties across the state. Basically what this chart is showing you is that it's not the case that rural counties get fewer state dollars per capita than the more urban counties. If anything, they're getting slightly more. The same is true for federal dollars, at least in 2010, okay? So you might look at this chart and say, but see, they're wrong. They don't know what they're talking about, that they're not actually getting less than other places in the state. Well, if you look at other indicators of the economic situation in our rural counties, then it's easier to understand why people look around them and experience life in these small communities and think, we're in a very difficult situation here and no one's paying attention to us. I want to show you rates of median household income, median household income across counties. Again, same 72 counties, same x-axis, so more towards 100% on the right side is more rural. Median household income is lower in our rural counties. A similar story exists with respect to poverty. Poverty is clearly an issue in our urban counties. It is clearly an issue in our rural counties as well. And finally, unemployment. It's a serious issue in our rural counties. So when they're complaining about the state of their local economy, there is empirical support for that. All right, how does this matter for Wisconsin politics? Let's go to Governor Walker and Act 10 for a moment. I want to give you some examples of how this worked. Wisconsin, the sentiments that I heard these back in 2007. But when 2010 rolled around in that gubernatorial election, Scott Walker knew how to make use of these sentiments and how to resonate with them. And I want to give you some examples of that. The high-speed train, if any of you recall that debate in the 2010 election between Madison and Milwaukee, that was great fodder for tapping into these sentiments. So, for example, in the first gubernatorial debate back in 2010, Scott Walker said this: if you look at what Jim Doyle and Tom Barrett have put on the table in spending $810 million on a high-speed train line between Milwaukee and Madison, with no assurance that it will go to Eau Claire or La Crosse or anywhere else, it's just about those two areas. And it's about taking that money that will cost the citizens of Wisconsin up to $10 million per year, according to their numbers. I think it will actually be more. That's $10 million that doesn't go to fix the road that goes up from West Salem through the cutout up to Black River Falls. It doesn't fix streets in La Crosse. That's money that's taken away from our local roads and our bridges and our other transportation needs today. Act 10 similarly tapped into sentiments about who's deserving, who's getting more than their fair share, about public employees being among them, not among us. Here's one example. Here's some remarks that Governor Walker made to the American Enterprise Institute when he was explaining Act 10, and he said, "We were able to rein in abuses of things like overtime and other excesses out there by no longer having opportunities where, in our case, some of our state employees could literally call in sick on their shift and then come back to work the next shift on overtime. Or bus drivers in places like Madison that made $150,000 or more because of overtime." Places like Madison. What's he talking about? Madison. So, okay, our presidential politics. I'm not going to go into this in depth because probably as I'm talking you can see how this resentment is showing up in our presidential campaign. But Donald Trump is tapping into something. A lot of times we talk about it as anger. In my mind, this resentment is so dangerous because it can be fomented into anger pretty easily. When someone comes along and says, "You're right, you are not getting your fair share, and I am someone who will steamroll over anyone who tells you that that's not the case." Donald Trump has a strong appeal. It's really scary to me, especially after yesterday. I know I'm not alone. When I opened up my state journal, yes, I still get the hard copy, and I read this story on page 5. I could not believe it. The headline alone scared me. Students at a varsity soccer game chanting things to each other, or chanting things to the opposing team, which apparently had Latino or Latino-looking players on it. But here's the really disturbing point. Sorry, it really gets me upset. Elementary schools were the ones chanting, "Trump, build a wall." So we have our work cut out for us, don't we? Here are the alternatives as I see them. I think that there are alternatives, and I would say all of you gathered here today are one source of hope. There are various ways, and people are getting together to try to lift up service to one another and the common good. Thank goodness. I think we need to ask more of our elected officials. When people are selling policy to us, I think we need to demand that they're not selling to us on the backs of our fellow citizens and not making arguments to us about who is deserving, less deserving, or who works hard than other folks. I also think we need to ask who our politicians are paying attention to, which constituents. Are we serving our rural areas, for example? In political science, there's sort of been this cascade of evidence lately showing that both at our federal level and our state level, it looks like policy is most responsive to the very wealthiest amongst us and not to other folks. That's a little bit worrisome, I would say. And we need to ask more of each other, too. Like I said, all of you here in this room, devoted Rotary members, you are doing this thing of lifting up service to others and the common good. And I have to say, and shout out to Mary Rouse for the Mortgage Center for Public Service. Just thank you for encouraging me to take this job, that being able to put my energy into a place where there are young people who believe in public service despite this crazy context has been really a lifesaver to me in the last few years. Finally, I think we need to question when we hear people saying, if only people weren't so stupid, right? We have to question whether the problem is really ignorant voters. Because taken to extremes, what that's saying is that the ordinary or the average American is not capable of participating in democracy. Is that really what we mean? I hope not. So thank you very much for your attention. I sincerely appreciate it. Oh, so sorry. I promised you a joke. Okay, so briefly, when I was doing my field work, oftentimes these sentiments, they were conveyed to me in a very delightful fashion. So I heard attitudes towards Madison and Milwaukee, but people were not mean to me. They knew I was a female social scientist from the flagship of the public university system, and they did not hold back clearly, but they were very kind to me in general. And so I want to share with you a little bit of what it felt like. So there's one community in central Wisconsin that I learned about after some pushing and pulling, that there's a dice game going on every morning in a wonderful little diner, and you have to know about it because you have to walk through the curtain at the back of the diner to get to it. And every morning at 6:30, there's a group of men, some on their way to work, some retirees, and they would start playing dice. The first time I went, they stopped playing dice, and then at the end of at the end of my time with them, they said, "Hey, do you know how to play ship captain and crew?" And I said, "Why, yes, I do. I grew up in Wisconsin. Ship captain and crew is this dice game where you get 5 dice in a cup, and you get 3 rolls. You have to shake a 6, a 5, and a 4 in that order, and then the remaining 2 dice determines how high your roll is." Well, on my third visit to this group, they're playing dice. I'm playing dice with them. And also, a little bit of background here is that there's a horse auction going on. And so they're asking me about the horse auction, just joking with me. And they say, "Why don't you buy one of them horses, Kathy? I got a trailer for you." And I say, "Well, I'm not sure where I would keep them." And they know, I live in Madison. They can park in my driveway if they come to a football game. And Henry says, "Huh?" And I say, "Well, I'm not sure where I would keep him." And Henry says, "Oh, you keep him in Madison. That's where they keep all the bullshit." And then he says, well, basically all you got to do is buy the front end of the horse. They got the back end in Madison. Okay, so very fun, but one big problem is that this time I'm winning, round after round. And this is 3 years into my fieldwork, so it's clear to me, and it's been clear to them for decades, that people from Madison come in and take all their money and run, so it's really uncomfortable. So here I am trying to joke with them to lighten the mood a little bit, because one man has already stormed off. Okay, so I say, hi, come, and I ask for your thoughts, and I take your money. And Richard says, "Oh, I tell you what, that's good, though, because we have so little of it here." And I say, "Well, it all goes to Madison anyway, right?" And Howard says, "We expect nothing less from Madison." And Richard says, "Well, at least it won't cost any postage to get it down there now." So thank you for your attention. Please.
What did you hear about the disparity of health care in rural Wisconsin?
Yeah.
And is this a way of delivering equity to rural Wisconsin?
Well, healthcare is a great issue. I heard a lot about healthcare. So my first question to every group on all of my rounds around was, what are the big concerns in your community? And back in 2007, In almost every group, healthcare was one of the top 3 concerns. So that was urban, rural, and suburban. And I heard it from people who didn't have healthcare. I heard it from employers who were worried about providing it for their employees. I heard it from people who were homeless. I heard it from lots of different people. But interestingly, when the 2008 presidential campaign happened and President Obama took office and then the debate about healthcare really ramped up, pretty quickly people took pretty strong stands for or against it, depending on which party they leaned toward. So Republicans who had said to me when I first met them, healthcare is a big concern and government's got to, do something about it. Not necessarily take over healthcare and have a single payer plan, but something's got to be done. But once the debate had ramped up, people were Republicans or right-leaning folks were very resistant to the government being the solution. Yeah.
Wait for the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Is it my turn?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Obviously, this is not just a Wisconsin problem, right? This is
Oh.
Is that good? Okay. So my question is, what's the difference between like Wisconsin and Minnesota, where Minnesota looks at their urban centers as the economic drivers, and here in the South, in Madison, Milwaukee, the University of Wisconsin, we are the economic drivers in many ways. Why isn't it the same level of resentment?
It's a great question, and I don't know, and it may be my next research project because the similarities between our states are vast, and yet the differences are pretty significant too. So I don't have a great answer. There's a question. Oh, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. The latest Kauffman Institute indicated Wisconsin was number 50 in job generation in 2015, and it's, I guess, well-known fact that about 75% of the jobs that are created in Wisconsin are created in Greater Madison, at least recently. How does that affect your constituency, your friends in the rural areas? Does it increase the resentment, or does it indicate some disillusionment with the Walker policies?
That's a great question. It's part of what's going on here is people being very aware that we're an increasingly urban society, and that, and not just in Wisconsin, but in every state of this nation, the job growth is in urban areas and the population growth too. And so people are aware of that, and yet there is a sense that something could be done to help them have a quality of life that they remember having at one time in their community, right? So at the same time, some people might recognize something is going right in the city. Oftentimes what I'm hearing is an interpretation of that is it's being achieved at our expense.
I have a question. Over here. I can understand the politics of resentment from small towns where they've lost employment, where the kids go to college and never come back, lower incomes, etc. But I assume your research covered Washington and Ozaukee and Waukesha counties, reddest counties in the state, very high income, understanding that they're kind of dependent economically on urban centers. They're suburbs. They're not really small towns. What kind of findings did you get from there? And does it match what you got elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, in those counties, I did not hear the same kind of, where geography was as meaningful to people. I didn't hear people talking about us and them in terms of geography, that our place isn't getting its fair share and other places are, right? But there were different forms of resentment, but probably the best way to explain it is in the election returns from the recent GOP primary, in which you saw basically what I heard maps onto the places that supported Trump versus the places that supported Ted Cruz. The places where I heard less sort of geographic resentment and less less of a sense of we are not getting our fair share with respect to more urban areas getting their fair share, that those places tended to go to Trump. So in the very red areas, that support for rolling back government had a different a different framework to it. So there was still a sense of resentment, or some people not working hard and being undeserving. But those conversations were more often around young people's work ethic or racial minorities. But then again, plenty of criticism about university employees and, how could it be that I'm not teaching classes even though I'm a professor. So
I'm quite intrigued by your presentation. One of the things I think you overlook, and a lot of people in Dane County overlook, because you have tenure, 1 out of 3 people in this county work for government. They're covered by civil service. They don't have any risks. The people you dealt with own farms. They own small businesses. They work for corporations that could lay them off at any point. They have a lot of invested money that they could lose overnight because they have bad crops, or someone like Walmart comes in and competes with them. So their economic situation is a little bit different than a lot of people that live in this community. Mm-hmm. They're taking real risk. And when you talk about economic inequality in this country, people overlook the fact that many successful people took big risks to get there. Not just getting a PhD or becoming a civil service employee. And I think that's what you're missing in terms of resentment between the people you talk to and people such as yourself or others working in government here.
thank you for that. I'll just let it stand on its own.
Another question. It seems to me the politics of resentment, at least at the national level, cuts both ways for both parties. Despite the image that you showed, implying it's a one-party directed resentment. And I'm also curious to know, my stereotype of what you're presenting is that perhaps it was a predominantly older audience, people who have the ability to be in that sort of situation. I'm just curious to know how else you may have stratified your sample demographically.
Yeah.
Were there women, for example, as part of what you talked about?
Sure. So the average person that I spent time with, or I just described the average group, was both men and women, a mix of retirees and people on their way to work, but predominantly older. And so after a few years, I started spending time with 4-H groups as well to try to get a sense of, what are younger people in some of these communities thinking. And it was pretty different in a lot of respects because 4-H students, some of you, any of you in here were part of 4-H? I'm sure, yeah. 4-H students are different, they're high achieving and oftentimes had their sights set on going to a city to work eventually. And so the attitudes I heard from them were slightly different. But you're right. I mean, and part of what your question raises, that the sentiments that I'm talking about do not necessarily describe the sentiment of every person in every small community in Wisconsin, right? Instead, what I am offering up is that when people say, how can people vote for the Republican Party in this state, these sentiments can help explain that. And can help understand why people would not think government is on their side, right, or government is working for them. Which gets me to the first part of your question about, I'm pointing to Republican examples here, but we're seeing, resentment and anger on the Democratic side as well in the presidential race, right? The difference for me is that part of the puzzle that I'm trying to understand is with respect to healthcare, for example. When people ask that question of how can people vote for the Republican Party, sometimes, the question gets put as, how can people be voting against their interests, right? How can people not favor Obamacare when they can't even afford health insurance themselves? And the answer, I think, lies in not that they're stupid or they're ignorant, but that they have a different interpretation, perhaps, than you do on the Democratic side of the role of government or how government ought to support a population. And so I'm not talking about the Democratic side, because what I'm talking about is the perspective that leads a person to choose for him or herself that more government is not what is in my interests, right? On the Democratic side, we may see resentment and anger at play, but it's not in service of an argument that says we need less government.
One more question, I think Mark.
I'm curious what you heard from people about their own local and state representatives versus the collective, and whether there's a parallel of us versus them, that, my representative is great, but then they go to Madison and there's all those other people.
Well, more often than not, what I heard was, my representative is a great guy or a great gal, but, they got to Madison and something happened. Something must happen when they get there because, so that, but then it also varied quite a bit by which representative they were talking about. So sometimes people would say, ours is the exception. He comes around, he spends time with us, we feel like he's really listening. Or thank goodness she's in there because she definitely pays attention and grew up here and knows us. But, there were definitely occasions where people would say, there you go. Just goes to show that they don't care, they're not listening. So it sort of depended on which representative we were talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It just goes to show.